Hi. I would like to thank everybody for having us here, and greetings from Texas. Or someone who introduced Aron in Scotland, Texas. Since I've come to England, I've learned that there's no such thing as a juice box. They call them cartons of juice. I ordered one, and the woman was like, "What?" But when I'm thinking, it's a box, and it has juice in it. It seems like in Texas we use less words. Like the other day, I passed a sign in England that said "unsuitable for diverted lorries," and in Texas the sign would say "no trucks." The longest sign I've ever seen or heard of in Texas was "no throwing fish on the road." In England, you probably don't have this problem. But if you did, that sign would probably say "unsuitable for diverted fish." I grew up in Texas. I don't have a Texas accent. A lot of people in Texas don't use the accent unless they're really proud of being American, proud Texan. We're going to start talking about how science education is affected by Christianity in Texas. But when I talk about Texas, there are a lot of reasonable people in Texas. When we go to the UK, a lot of times it's like, we don't have the problem here with creationism. And maybe you do a little bit if you're having charter schools and stuff like that, where they might teach it, but not the same thing, so they have a hard time identifying. But we go to Ireland, or Northern Ireland, and it's kind of like being in an atheist support group in Texas, where we all get together and we commiserate. We go, basically, these people are crazy, you know. Anyways, so I was born in 1971, and I was the child of divorced parents. My father remarried a Texan, and he took us to Southern Baptist church 3 times a week. My mother was Vietnamese and Catholic, and it isn't a Catholic, a liberal Catholic. It's kind of a fundamentalist Catholic, where if you piss a nun off, they'll whip you or something like that. And so I had this kind of strange upbringing. And growing up, I guess the education system itself was poor in teaching science and evolution, because I didn't really understand it. And I think perhaps because they skipped it. And from the pulpit, they were always ridiculing it. And humanists, they would say humanists with like this in a pejorative way. Humanists, you know? They just think they're their own god, you know? And anyways, it was pre-internet. The internet, I didn't get on the internet until the 1990s, when it was just message boards. And I was an older creationist for a long time. I'm a science teacher now, so I've come a long way since then. I was in my 30s by the time I was starting to learn about evolution, because it was so isolated without the internet growing up that you relied on information from your school and from your community. And I grew up in a part of Texas, Spring, Texas, that gave you, if you ever seen Revisionaries, Terry Leo. She represented my district where I grew up. So when my brother went off to the East Coast to study, he told me he was agnostic. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I actually said, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? And so he quickly educated me on that. It's like saying, if our language came from German and other sources like Latin, why is there still German? You know, it's a fundamental misunderstanding. And anyways, when I went on the internet, I went to Christian forums to hang out with other Christians, and I went to to the Creation Evolution Forum, and there I met lots of atheists who liked to go there and try and deconvert, not necessarily from Christianity, but maybe a little bit, people from creationism. And Aron was there. This was like, what was that?
7 years ago.
7 years ago. And some people were rude, and some people weren't, but I've never been someone who was dissuaded by being called ignorant or something like that. I just kept persisting until I figured it out. And since then, I was teaching in a Christian school, and I taught second graders, and they would have things in the workbooks like, well, if a butterfly egg only hatches butterflies, it never changes into anything else. And they're still teaching this now in a lot of Christian schools in the United States. And of course it does. What would you expect? I mean, they expect like dogs turn into cats or something like that. Some ridiculous strawman of evolution. And a lot of people, like 40% the number is, still don't. That shows you the poverty of science education in the United States. So I actually debated with Aron, and he showed me a whole bunch of things about evolution. And the thing that kind of swayed me was he showed me a picture of a penguin. Penguin is a mammal that has scales. So for me, it was hard going jumping dog to snake. But then when you think about it, superficial characteristics aren't that magical. So that kind of sealed it for me. And not just that. And that's where I met him, and I decided that I was upset because I had been raised so ignorant, and I could have died not understanding origins or a lot of the things about the universe that I understand now. Because Christianity and sometimes people get upset when I say Christianity, like they're a Christian to accept evolution. But if you look at it and you read it as written, like a lot of Christians do, it kind of makes you incurious. Because the Genesis is like everything in 7 days. It's all set out for you. It's all simple. But the truth is takes a little more time to understand. So that's where we came from, and he's going to tell you about how what his science education was like growing up in Arizona.
All over. By the time I moved to Texas in middle school, I'd already lived in 9 other states. I was taught that skeptics were cynics, that they were missing the big picture, that they were missing out on the joy, that we couldn't experience awe and wonder, as Oprah Winfrey once put it. I was taught to believe whatever I'd seen on TV or in the newspapers, despite the fact that one of the most popular newspapers at that time was the Weekly World News, which had stories about Bat Boy and the Loch Ness Monster and reptilian aliens secretly governing over us. I saw a number of documentaries that I thought were vetted. You see I didn't know what a mockumentary was, so I'm watching science documentaries in the 1970s. There was one called In Search Of. It was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. So, of course, everything he said sounded logical. And they did a show on Curlian photography. And this is where you take a leaf and you put it in electrostatic plates, between electrostatic plates. You take a picture of it, and you see that leaf represented in tiny phosphorescent blue sparks, what some people might refer to as midichlorians. Then if you take the leaf and cut it in half, you take the same picture again. On the initial exposure, you only see half the leaf, but on an overexposure, you would see the full leaf. And this, to me, was proof of life force. You can actually photograph what isn't there, proof of life force. And remember that I'm watching what I think is a science documentary. And I've also gotten a number of books that people would give to me, like Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken. I'm 12 years old, right? I'm fed all this nonsense about the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and the tabloids and so on. So I think that I have sound scientific reasons to believe the things that I do. But I noticed at some point, being very interested in cryptozoology and the discovery of Bigfoot and things of that order, that there were only certain books that ever mentioned the things that I liked to believe in. And they were all contradicting each other. So if you try to confirm anything, you go to science books, and the science books never mention Bigfoot or Noah or anything of that order. So I thought, maybe I should just read the kinds of books that would reinforce what I already wanted to believe. And as soon as I said that to myself, I realized instantly how dishonest that is. And I think that a great many believers have come to that same point where they ask that same question and they went the other way, where they will just continue to pursue whatever reinforces their belief. To me, it mattered more whether it was true, and so I needed to investigate each of the things that I believed in. This wasn't easy to do in the 70s, so we didn't have an internet. So it was virtually impossible to disprove or verify any of the things that I believed in. But later on, I started knocking down one after another. Until finally, I get the internet, and the first thing I look up is what are the advances that they've made in the last 20 years regarding Curlian photography. And what I found was an article written by the scriptwriters of In Search Of, admitting that it was for entertainment only and that they'd made the whole thing up, and everybody on the show knew that it was all imaginary, that it was faked. There wasn't any truth to it at all. Now, by that, oh crap. Mom. All right, well, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. I had already figured out that there was no Bigfoot, primarily because I was mistaken for him in the newspaper. I was hitchhiking through a forest in New Mexico, and yeah. I know that it was me, because I was being circled by coyotes for miles. And I tried to drive them away by roaring at them. Like, I figured that would do it. And then I couldn't get anybody to pick me up. I'm wearing a black sweater, right? I have this, right? And I'm wandering around in the dark, and then I want to get the car's attention, so I do the same thing. I wave my arms and I roar. Well, I come back to that same town a couple of days later, and people tell me, you got to watch out because we had Sasquatch out here. It was cited by all these different people, these ranchers and all of that. It was all in the newspapers and everything, and I just kind of pieced it. Yeah, that was not. That was actually the moment I stopped believing in Bigfoot, because it's hard to believe when you're him. I also pieced together all of these other things about the telekinesis. The Russians, they could move the magnets with the power of their minds or whatever. These little hand gestures. Well, it turns out that it's acting up the ball bearings. They're moving with the magnets under the table and all of that. It's all a scam. It's all a hoax. Everything that involved the supernatural all turned out to be unsupported at best. And I'd actually had supernatural experiences because I was a neo-pagan occultist at one point. I did all the meditation, I did, building up the psionic energy in your hands that you can fire at other people, all of that. Transit, or not all meditation, but astral projection. So I had direct experience with all of these things. I've witnessed ghosts and, paranormal monsters and all of that sort of thing. I actually experienced that, and I remember vividly. But I came to a point, after the Curlian photography point, where I realized I had no substance for any of these beliefs that never made sense to begin with. I just had to reconcile, if there is living life force, if we have evidence of telekinesis and all that, then there has to be some truth to it. But when I realized it wasn't it, I had to look back on the memories that I had, that I remember seeing with my own eyes, and realizing that didn't happen. I remember it happening, but it couldn't have happened. And that was a hard thing to realize, that I'm remembering something that isn't even there. And then I later, through the power of the internet, you find many people that you haven't seen in high school, or haven't seen since high school. And these were the people that were taking part in these kinds of things with me that I thought would remember the same events the same way that I did. And neither of the two people that were involved in the most dramatic episodes remembered it at all. And it was stunning that I made the whole damn thing up. So whenever anybody tells me about their incredible supernatural encounter. It's never as brilliant a story as the one I had, and I know that mine failed, so yours is definitely dust. You want to take your turn?
Okay. Well, after I started to understand evolution as a result of talking with Aron and other atheists on Christian forums, I was wanting to say, to think that maybe there are a lot of other people that we could help understand evolution. And so I set up a debate between Aron and a creationist called Mark Ramsey. He basically tries to get stuff like Icons of Evolution, if any of you have ever heard of Jonathan Wells, books into Texas science classrooms. In Texas science classrooms, you have a textbook which is creationism free, but teachers can use supplemental materials. So sometimes he encourages them to use these books instead. And a good percentage of science teachers in Texas are creationists, and that's pretty odd.
That's 20%, roughly 20% of our science teachers are younger creationists.
It's partly because perhaps they're not held enough to a high enough standard when they take their certification test to teach science. And it's also the culture also. And for some reason, that's where, I mean, I've taught with other science teachers when I don't know if you all remember when Pluto was decommissioned as a planet. And her take on that to her students was that, see, science can be wrong. And I tried to explain it to her, and she was a well-meaning person and a good friend, but for some reason, Christians use social studies and science to preach at their captive audience of students. And I thought, so I arranged this debate between him and Mark Ramsey, and I thought perhaps he could persuade him that he was wrong, but it soon went way off course with him talking about Anthony Flew. I don't know if you remember the whole Anthony Flew thing. He's English? No, he's some English person with a doctoral degree who decided that he was not an atheist.
Yeah.
So the debate quickly devolved into talking about atheism rather than science. Yeah.
And she set up this debate, and it was with the guy that was courting the Board of Education, who was trying to convince several people on the board that they needed to teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. And in the course of the debate, I tried to get him to list what the strengths of evolution were, and he couldn't list one. As for the weaknesses of evolution, they were entirely his own misunderstanding of basic science, much less anything having to do with evolution. So we set up a moderated debate. We wanted to have 6 moderators, and I chose 3 Christians to moderate my side. I wanted it to be, all of the moderators were Christian, and I wanted it to be that way so that it would not devolve into a God versus no God argument. So I had my professor of genetics, who was cited in Nature for contribution to the Human Genome Project. I had Robert T. Bacher, who was he was one of the consultants for Jurassic Park. If you're into paleontology, this is the guy with the long white hair and the cowboy hat who looks like a prospector with a mule. But he has PhD degrees from 2 Ivy League colleges. He also happens to be a Pentecostal preacher, if you can figure that out. And he had a book he was working on called Bones, Bibles, and Creation, or whatever, how he reconciles his belief. And then I had a geologist, a petrogeologist named Glenn Morton, who was not friendly to atheists at all, but he was critical of younger creationism, because as a geologist, of course, he knew the proof otherwise. So I have these 3 Christians, and I think anything my opponent says that's off track, they will correct, right? Except they didn't. He chose 3 moderators of his own, 2 people from the Board of Education, which were the exact 2 people that I wanted to influence. Because I'm expecting...
And Don McElroy.
Yeah.
You remember Don McElroy?
Right, yeah.
Amazing.
They don't live in Texas.
Yeah.
So yeah, he chose 2 people from the Board of Education, and he also chose another evangelical minister. A whack job of a guy that is supposed to be moderating this. And the debate immediately devolved into God versus no God, you're not a true Christian. It's the moderators arguing with each other. I didn't even have to take part in it. I mean, I did one post to disprove everything that he said. All of that was ignored. They argue with each other. And then one of them decided he was going to change sides because he didn't want a non-Christian to beat a Christian in a debate. Wow. My own moderators used the forum at my invitation as a platform to argue against atheism, thank you very much, and it was completely ignoring the purpose of this, which was to improve education in the state.
So I quickly learned that there are people who are ignorant of science because they've been cultured that way, and there are people that have been shown enough evidence to understand evolution, but they're going to discard it because they're being willfully ignorant.
A good example of that, my opponent said that he knew that there were transitional species in the fossil record, but that he wanted to teach students there were none, because he said it was important that they believe there are none. So it's okay to lie to other people's kids when you know better. It's because you're controlling what they believe, and that's more important than telling them the truth.
Ken Ham is another good example of that. He was debating an old Earth creationist, Hugh Ross, and he said that you can't have millions of years, and it's billions, but you can't have millions of years. He always says that. And he said because what about like dinosaurs with brain tumors? If you got millions of years, then death, suffering, disease happen before the fall. If you place dinosaurs the way scientists do.
So what he's saying is he says that he knows that there's fossils from 65 plus million years ago that show that these kind of maladies occurred, and so this would not be something that God would say is good. So knowing that evidence exists, but knowing that his favorite book of fables says otherwise, he simply ignores the evidence. And I've heard people make the admission that when you make this assumption, it's okay to ignore all the evidence that stands against it. That's not my philosophy. I certainly wouldn't justify that. I think that's dishonest. But believers have justified that.
Ham's argument is the Bible is inerrant from Genesis to Revelations. So if you don't take Genesis literally, then you can't have the progression from Adam to Jesus, and you can't be saved.
Another way of putting it, he says if you want to believe in salvation, which is the second half of the book, then you have to believe in creation, which is the first half of the book. Because the first half of the book is wrong, the second half of the book is wrong. So to me, it just means the whole damn book is wrong. He's just pretending.
Maybe this sounds outlandish to you, but he convinces a lot of people. He's spending over $40 million to build an ark.
170 million.
To build an ark, and people gave him that money to spend.
I wish he were building that in low ground, where it would likely flood, just so we can show that it won't float. I would also like to see them use that to house a zoo. Because wouldn't that be great to see just put a zoo inside the ark and then only allow 8 people to shovel shit every day out of that one window?
Aron also says he would like to see him construct it like one man and his family construct it.
One 600-year-old guy using Bronze Age tools and unskilled laborers instead of hydraulic equipment. What's that? Okay, so it was a result of this debate and a couple of other things that I said. Whoops, just my microphone. Okay, a couple of arguments that I had with other people that inspired me to do this video series. I was talking to a friend who very much believed in creationism, and she said, you can't prove evolutionism. So, well, the fact that you call it that already indicates the problem, but yes, I can.
I love how evolution, I hear sometimes pronounced in England, evolution.
That's the way they would like to pronounce it too. So she said, you can't prove evolutionism. And I said, of course, that I can. And she goes, well, prove it then. I said, well, I can't prove it standing here, because there's a substantial amount of information that you need to have. So I'll tell you what, you give me some time, I'll put together a presentation that will explain all the evidence indicating, and I will prove evolution to your satisfaction. She goes, you can't prove evolution because you'd have to disprove God. I said, well, whether God exists or not is irrelevant. And she staggered backwards. I did the presentation. It was the first 4 videos of what became the Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism video series. And I sent those first 4 videos to her when they were completed, and her response to me was that I was hurting people. People who want to believe something even when they know it's not true, which is the real problem. Some people care about truth and some people don't. I see them having instead just a need to believe. So I completed the video series. It became hugely popular, and then Pitchstone Publishing asked me to do a book on it, which I did, and that should be out in September. I don't even know if it's any good yet. I like it.
So, in my profession, a lot of American parents are afraid to send their children to college because they're going to be deconverted from Christianity. They're afraid of evolution. A lot of Christians are. And they're afraid that it will cause people to lose their faith. And unfortunately for me, it was part of what caused me to lose my faith in God. Why would God design a system that's dependent on suffering, death, and why do we have to eat other organisms to live? I mean, if you're an omniscient deity, couldn't you come up with a better?
I mean, plants can make their own food. Why can't we?
Yeah, why couldn't we be autotrophs? But if this was an all-powerful, all-knowing deity, right? And that was part of it. And also, I didn't have a very good science education, but I had a pretty okay reading and literature education. And when I looked at Genesis again, how is it different from any of the other myths from all around the world? It's an origin myth. It's very plainly so. So after that, I'm still trying to help people understand it so that we can get past the culture war over it. And so me and Aron are making a science. I taught science for 7 years, and now I teach teachers how to use their science curriculum.
And I want to brag about this because when I started, she was working in a religious school. And then she became a science teacher in a public school. I thought that huge jump. And then she moved on to become a curriculum specialist where she teaches teachers how to teach science, which was, I thought, outstanding.
We started this, the Living Science video series because of our experiences talking to grown adults who don't have a middle school science education and don't know what they're talking about. But also my experiences in teaching school where Christianity often made students incurious. Like, I'm like, we're going to learn where mountains come from today. I don't need to know that. God made them. Like, I'd have a student pipe up and say that. And I don't understand because if I'd rather know more. But that this meme is such that it blocks natural curiosity in children. And so also for teachers, because I train teachers and I've gone to trainings with other science teachers, and a lot of times they don't understand very basic science. Like for some reason we had an assignment to make a picture of the Milky Way galaxy, and one of the other science teachers was like, well, let's draw a jug of milk. And I'm thinking, you don't know the name of your own galaxy, and you're teaching science. And I know. So we make short 10-minute videos that help, that are based on the next generation science standards, which not every state in the United States adopts, but most of them do. And so that it can supplement and keep teachers on track and also explain evolution in an incremental way, and integrate it into biology curriculum. So.
All right, so that's what we do. We've been told we have to stop now, so we're going to shut up. Thank you.
We do have time for 3 very short questions. We need to get everyone demiked for the upcoming panel, so we'll get these done very quickly.
So I have a question about creationist ideology in action in the States.
Creationist
And
theology.
after Dover versus Kitzmiller, how do you think creationist efforts have evolved? And what challenges does that bring to people like the people at the NCAC to counter that?
Well, the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial was a huge failure for the intelligent design movement. However, they simply ignored their loss and found other ways to work around it. Through loopholes that they found in a number of different states, they have found different means in different places to continue teaching the Bible as if it's literal fact. You have teachers who refuse to teach evolution largely because they don't believe in it or don't understand it, which is just as bad. And then you have people having like literature classes, comparative religion classes, or Bible lesson classes, where they teach the Bible as if it were scientific and historic fact. And these lessons include denigration of other religions, a rejection of science, anti-Semitism, and the instilling of conservative right-wing political ideology. And this is going on in thousands of schools all across the country. And it's a really sad thing that we can show that these lessons are not correct, but you can't show that to every kid, because every kid in the country is being taught something similar all across the country by every authority figure they know. This is a grassroots problem.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering, especially you talked at the end about the difficulties of teaching teachers how to teach science. First of all, do you have any, first of all, are there any standards? What standards do these people have to get to the level where they can actually teach science? But secondly, do you think, has you got a situation where they found out almost who you are and then recoiled and just ignored what you said, or would act against any of your advice purely because you're an atheist, say, or because you're not of their denomination of Christianity or something?
Well, that's a good question. In Texas, you just have, in order to teach middle school science, which is where a lot of people are misunderstanding evolution, is at a very basic level, you just have to pass a generalist test. So you have like a test with 4 sections, one on math, science, reading, and social studies. So you can maybe flunk like 50% of the science portion of that test and maybe still get a passing score. So, and that's part of the reason why there's a problem, like there isn't more rigorous testing and training and requirements for science teachers.
To make it worse, we also have AP classes where you can take a college class in high school, which involves a high school teacher teaching college, but sometimes the high school teacher in biology is not a science teacher, it's a coach, like a gym coach. So in one case, we had this one gym coach who was supposed to be teaching zoology at the college level. Now, how could you avoid evolution teaching zoology, right? So this guy wasted at least 3 weeks worth of this curriculum by having the students do mock debates using the written material of Ann Coulter. Utterly avoiding evolution altogether. And I had a concerned parent write to me about this, say, what do I do about it? I said, well, I'll tell you what, write to this teacher, but make sure that you include the carbon copy, not one carbon copy. Make sure he sees it, that you're also sending this letter to his principal, and to me, and with American Atheists, and to the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and to the Texas Freedom Network, and there's a number of other activist organizations. Let him see all the addresses up there, and ask him, did you really tell my kids this? Is this really what you did for the last 3 weeks? In 30 minutes, he got a response. Said, I was just kidding. 3 weeks worth of wasted curriculum. JK, no foul.
Okay, one last question.
Yes.
Dale's hand is up.
I think there are 2 people. Both of those people will
You were talking earlier about like how some people just don't listen to reason, they prefer to ignore facts. So how have you dealt with kind of reasoning with unreasonable people? Do you kind of just have to go through the legal system, or like what sort of routes do you kind of use to actually interact with them?
Well, so far, of all the people that I've talked to directly, the only person I've ever tried to was a creationist when I started talking to him, and who changed their mind as a result of our conversation, married me. So I have limited success in that. But what I have done, and what I think is really effective, is whenever, like I said, we did this wonderful thing in Ireland. Me and PZ Myers happened across Hamza Sortis and some people from the IERA. And so they immediately started hounding him about embryology, not knowing who the hell he was, right? So it turns out that he's a developmental biologist, and he hasn't explained that he's a developmental biologist. So they immediately switched the topic to geology. Oh, you know what you're talking about? Here, let me change the subject. Because this is what they do, right? And then I happen to know what he was talking about in geology, so I addressed that. So it was a nightmare for them. But the problem is you can't let them change subjects. They will never admit that point A is wrong. They'll bring up point B, right? You got to focus back on, let's address this one first. And the biggest problem that I have when I try to do the challenge to these people is, you know, starting with definitions, for example. Mark Ramsey refused to use definitions. He said he wouldn't even participate in the debate if we used them. He said he wanted to let people decide what they think these words should mean. Because it's all a game, right? It's a shell game. It's not about honestly understanding anything. So if you try to engage them to get them to understand a particular concept and get them to admit that they understand this concept before you move on, they will very quickly stop you. Sometimes with the admission that they don't want to know, they just want to believe.
That particular type of person you're talking about, professional creationists, they have a vested interest in not accepting what you're saying, any evidence. They get you out, you prove something, well, what about this? You do what? What about this? They never acknowledge that you've proven they're correct. But there are some people he's helped through his video series.
And if you don't know what a Gish Gallop is, it's Dwayne Gish from the Institute for Creation Research. He would go up into debates and he would like fire out so many lies in 1 minute that you couldn't possibly address them all, and any that you didn't disprove count as wins for him, at least to his half of the audience.
All right, let's thank Aron and Lilandra one more time.